Hey guys, I hope you're all enjoying the seminar so far. One thing that I was kind of thinking is we could keep this a little bit more casual. I don't know if you guys want to put on your cameras and mics, that's fine too, but feel free to like interrupt me if you have any questions or just like message Drew and he can interrupt me because I think it's easier if we have a back and forth just because it's been a while since I've been in your shoes. So I just want to make sure I'm giving you relevant information. But yeah, like of course cameras are always welcome, so I'm not talking to a bunch of blank screens. Um, but yeah, I'll just get started on. So I practice. I'm going to the business law group, which is kind of what colloquially you guys would think of as corporate law. And just to kind of get a bit of a background, because Canada is based on the old English system, we kind of have two. Lawyers are really grouped into two main types of lawyers, which is litigators or barristers and solicitors. And barristers are like the lawyers who go to court. These are like your litigation lawyers, the ones who have to argue. Usually when there's two parties that have hit an impasse, this is kind of where barristers and litigators come in. On the other side, what we have is solicitors, which are what are called like the more transactional lawyers. So we're the kind of ones who structure deals, do the paperwork, draft contracts. And generally then if something goes wrong and there's like an inherent disagreement, then we'll pass it on to the barristers or litigators who will actually go and argue in court. So one important thing to keep in mind with like corporate law and transactional law in general is we don't really go to court. We're not really court lawyers. We're mostly the ones who do all the paperwork and the drafting and the structuring and stuff like that. And yes, once again, like please feel free to ask questions. Like please don't hesitate to interrupt me. So the whole notion of business law and corporate law will really depend on the firm that you're at, and everyone will kind of have a different opinion of what falls into the corporate law umbrella. But generally speaking, corporate lawyers are those who act on behalf or with companies or corporations. And within corporate law, you really have two main groupings that it goes into. We have what's called private, which is like private M&A or private equity, and we have public lawyers, which is like securities and capital markets, which is what I'm going to go into. So the difference between a public company and a private company is a public company is traded on a public stock exchange. So think of something like the Toronto Stock Exchange, the New York Stock Exchange, the Chicago Stock Exchange. And what this means is members of the public can buy and sell shares of the company, which is a part ownership stake in the company. And then when they buy shares of the company, they either take the gain that the company, so the company goes up in value, they gain that, or if the company goes down in value, they lose that. But that's their part ownership of the company. Whereas private, and so when you think of public companies, think of like Amazon, Google, Canada Goose, Canadian Tire, like massive, massive companies. On the other hand, what you have is private companies. These tend to be a little bit smaller. So think of, your more like maybe mom and pop shop, your more family-owned businesses, which are not listed on a publicly traded exchange. They're privately owned, and the shares are usually owned by private individuals, i.e. they're not sold to the public in the same way that public companies are. So the reason why this is important is because the way the government looks at it is being a public company, it gives you access to a lot of resources because now anybody can buy and sell your shares. So you have a lot of money coming in and going out. And the government thinks of that as a right or as a privilege, not a right. What that means is if you are a publicly traded company, there's a lot of rules and regulations that you have to follow. And so an example of this is what we call disclosure. That means like for a company to be publicly listed on a stock exchange, it has to give out all of its information to the public. Things like how much money it makes, what its expenses are, what the management thinks the future of the company is going to be, if the company's planning on expanding, what is the company doing to address climate change. Like all these things have to be made to the public so that when you buy and sell shares, you can make an informed decision. Whereas private companies don't have those same regulations. So the difference between being a capital markets or securities corporate lawyer, a public market corporate lawyer, or a private market corporate lawyer is in the public market, you're going to be very heavily involved in the law. There's a lot of rules and regulations. And the perfect analogy I can think of, is that a question? Okay. And the perfect analogy I can think of is for public company corporate law, it's kind of like being in a maze. Like you're trying to navigate the maze. It's a closed system and you're trying to figure out what's the best way that I can kind of, get my client what they want while also adhering to all these rules and regulations. Whereas private companies don't have those same rules. So it's a little bit more of a free for all. So that's kind of that's the two tenets of kind of what makes up corporate law. Private companies or public companies. Lawyers specialize in both, but there tends to be more lawyers on public companies because they're bigger and they make up a larger part of our economy. Now, the whole structure of corporate law is based around the concept of deals. And a deal can be anything. A deal can be, I'm selling my company, I'm buying my company, I'm trying to raise a bunch of money through the markets, I'm trying to go public, anything like that. But the key thing to keep in mind with corporate law is whenever you have a deal, there's a very clear starting point and there's a very clear ending point. So someone will come to me and say, I want to raise $100 million by selling shares. And they might come on October 5th. And then they're going to announce that the deal is going to close on November 22nd. So now me as a corporate lawyer, I have between October 5th and November 22nd to get this deal moving and get this deal going. And so what we will do on the day-to-day will really depend on what needs to be done for the deal. Usually we'll start with something along the lines of, okay, the very basics is what is the regulatory landscape that we have to go through, okay? Is there a conflict of interest issues? Is there something that's being triggered with the way that the shares are being sold? Anything like that. Then we have to go through, we have to negotiate with the other side, because usually another side is going to be buying the bulk of the shares. So you have to negotiate, what price are you guys going to sell it at? When are you guys going to pay us? How are you guys going to pay us? What is your right of refusal? When can you back out from the contract? So that's kind of when all the stuff that we're going to be negotiating. And then we'll go into the nitty gritty of drafting the contracts, making sure everything's in order. For public companies, anytime you do something, you have to get all the directors, all the executives, everyone to vote and pass it. So you have to go through all that regulatory landscape right up until the deal closes. So for corporate lawyers, we tend to have a little bit more of, and I kind of mentioned this in the networking session, we tend to have a little bit more of a unpredictable lifestyle, because we kind of have to do what needs to be done for the deal to close at this time. And generally speaking, our clients are more demanding because they're corporations and they need stuff done quickly. And so with the October 5th and November 22nd, deal starting, deal closing analogy, think of it like you're writing a final exam, right? The closer you get to the exam, the more you're going to be working. It's going to kind of ramp up, and then you're going to write the exam, and then it's going to be like, whew, okay, fine, I have a little bit of time. I have a little bit of relief before my next exam or my next deal. And so that's kind of one of the main differentiators between corporate law and other types of law, is we tend to have a little bit more of an erratic lifestyle, which can be good and can be bad, because it's good because, sometimes you don't have to work a lot. Some days I go home at 2 p.m. and some days you have to work really long nights. I know a lot of people really want to ask, what do corporate lawyers do? Like, what's your day-to-day? And that's a very difficult question to answer, because our day-to-day differs a lot, because we really are doing everything we can to get the deal closed. So that could be anything from getting the financial statements to send to the accountants, to negotiating the deal structure, to talking with the employment lawyers to make sure that, if we're buying a company, making sure there's no employment issues. If we're buying a company and they have licenses, then we have to talk with the licensing lawyers to make sure there's no licensing issues. So we're just kind of putting all of that together and structuring everything. And really what we are is we are the middle person between the company and the lawyers, right? Especially at the higher levels, we are the people who are trying to convert the legalese into the corporate speak and the corporate speak into the legalese. Because if someone comes and says, I want to raise $100 million in shares, from a corporate perspective, that might mean one thing, but from a legal perspective, that's a bunch of very, very little steps. So I just want to stop. Does anyone have any questions? Because I know it's a lot of information and it's a little bit convoluted. So if anyone has any questions, please either let me or Drew know.
I actually had one come in. Someone asked, what do you wish you had known about corporate law before you started?
That's a really good question. So one thing about corporate law is it's very economically dependent. So when the economy is doing very, very well, you're very, very busy. And when the economy is not doing very well, you're not very busy. So for example, when COVID hits, the corporate lawyers were probably the worst hit. But when the economy was booming, we were the most busy. So the one thing that I kind of wish that I'd known is that, and that I kind of learned is, especially at the junior levels, you're not really going to have an extremely stable workload as you might have in other types of law. Like when you think of things like employment law or bankruptcy law or tax law, whether the economy is good or bad, there's still these issues that arise. But for corporate lawyers, when the economy is bad, no one really wants to do anything because they just want to save their money. So it's very economically dependent. It's very dependent on how the current market trends are doing and so on.
Okay. Thank you.
I just had a quick question. Do corporate lawyers make money based on like a base salary, or is it like how many transactions they've made that year?
So it depends on the firm. So most of the big corporate firms, as associates, we make a base salary and then we get a bonus based on how much we bill. And then once you make partner, then you just get a cut of either how much you bill and a cut of the firm's profits. So uh, it doesn't really depend on how many transactions, because you can have a really long transaction where you build a lot of money, or you can have a bunch of really short transactions where you haven't built a lot. But as associates, we'll get a salary and then a bonus.
Okay, and I know some lawyers are client based, like it's based on like maybe real estate lawyers, they get their money based on like their clients. Is that the case for corporate lawyers?
Yeah, so we kind of essentially we group lawyers into three main things, which we call them like finders, minders, and grinders. So finders are kind of like, I guess colloquially, what you call like the rainmakers. So they don't really practice a lot of law. They just bring in clients and they serve as kind of the middle communicator between the client and the law firm. So for example, if a client has very unreasonable deadlines, it's going to be like the rainmaking or the finder lawyer who's really going to be negotiating with the client and trying to manage expectations and making sure that they're happy and so on. A lot of the more rainmaking client or lawyers tend to not practice law as much, which tends to go more towards the junior person, or I guess what we call grinders, who are just like the lawyers who really bill and do all the work. But that's for most types of law. You're going to have the people who bring in the business, and then the people, and they kind of bring in a big piece of business and they kind of cut up the pie and they give the pie off to different people, and that's kind of how they sustain themselves.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Any other questions?
I had one more from someone who asked earlier. They wanted to know what books or journals would you recommend that we read?
Books or journals? So, I mean, if you're really interested, especially in like securities law, like it would always be good to know what's going on with market trends, like what type of industries are doing well in the long term. So anything like that would be very helpful. For example, like when I summered, it was during, like, I don't know if you guys are aware, but like in 2018, we had a huge cannabis boom. Like the markets were on fire when when the Liberal government announced the legalization of cannabis. So cannabis was huge. Like it was like there were so many cannabis deals, like you couldn't not have a cannabis deal. And then it kind of died down, and all of a sudden we went back to mining. So kind of understanding the market trends and understanding like what was going on with cannabis, why it was such a big deal back then, why it wouldn't sustain itself, what's the next kind of type of industry that's going to rise is something that's really helpful. And that's one thing that I really like about corporate law, because it's really industry specific. Like the industries kind of um, go back and fall and so on. And just kind of understanding that how markets work and why markets behave the way they do is very important. So I have one here. Are there any opportunities you would recommend for high schoolers who want to pursue a career in corporate law? I don't think it would hurt to kind of shadow a corporate lawyer, or like just shadow a lawyer in general. The thing about corporate law is a lot of people have a lot of perceptions and they think it's a lot more glamorous than it really is. It's a really nuts and bolts type of law. Like you have to have the ability to sit down and read contracts and get into the details and the nits and grits of all the regulations and so on. I don't think there's anything that would necessarily make you more attractive or anything, but I think just understanding how corporate law works and kind of what lawyers do would make it a lot easier for you to make a decision.
I had another one sent by Miriam. She wanted to know, how is the job market looking for lawyers right now, like just in general, not specifically for corporate lawyers?
So the economy is doing really well. So the job market was really hot. Right now, because of COVID, certain types of law I think are a little bit slower, corporate law being one of them. I don't think there's a lot of hiring going on for lawyers at the moment, just because I think everyone's kind of waiting for the economy to recover. In general, the job market is good if you're good at what you do. I know there's a lot of things, there's a lot of people who like a lot of issues with like lawyers not being able to find articling, and it definitely is like an oversaturated market. But the answer is always, if you're good at what you do, you will always be in high demand. Even my colleagues during COVID, who I know were really talented, they got scooped up by firms really quickly. But there definitely is, I think, a little bit of oversaturation, and with more law schools coming up, I think it is becoming an issue. So people have to be more aware of what they're getting into, and so on in that regard. So I have a question here as well. Is an educational background in business absolutely critical for corporate law? No, it's not. I did my MBA and I found it useful, but absolutely not. I know so many successful corporate lawyers who come from arts background. I know like my principal, who's a very, very well-regarded securities lawyer, he didn't even want to do securities. Like he wanted to do another type of law, and they just hired him and he went into it, and he had no background in corporate law or anything. So it's absolutely not necessary. Business background might make it a little bit easier to understand the terms, like different types of terms like shares, securities, short selling, things like that. But really you can pick that up really quickly, and you mostly learn on the job.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Any other questions?
So is that mainly how you specialize in a certain kind of law after law school? Like you
Yes.
can apply to any job?
Yeah, so you 100% do not specialize in law school. You can take classes if there's something that you're interested in. And, obviously, if you really want to be a family lawyer and you don't take any classes in family law, then maybe a family law firm might be like, all right, well, like you say you want to be a family lawyer, but your actions don't really indicate that. That might be where it's useful to take certain classes. But for actual specialization, we are very much an apprenticeship profession. That's what we're based around. We're based on learning on the job. So even when you walk out of law school, you know very little. It's mostly an articling in your first couple of years. And I'm still just scratching the surface of like what securities law is and the different nuances of the field.
Thank you.
No problem. And if you guys have any like broad questions about like law school or anything like that too, I'm happy to answer them. I just graduated last year, so I'm still a little bit like still fairly fresh in my mind.
I had a question. I'm thinking about applying to law school soon. So like, what would you recommend as like extracurriculars or like something to get involved in during your undergrad to like make you more appealing to law schools, basically?
So the honest answer is extracurriculars don't really matter for law schools. They only really care about grades and LSATs. When extracurriculars usually matter is when they're very exceptional. So like it's like people who like competed in like the Olympics for Canada or something, like really, really standout extracurriculars. With that being said, I would definitely say get involved in things that interest you and things that you're passionate about, because if you can write a good essay about something that you're really passionate about, law schools like that. It doesn't have to be related to law. It doesn't have to be related to corporate law or anything. They just want people who, are good students, have a certain level of academic excellence, and, enjoy what they do and seem passionate about the work. And then everything else kind of fits into place.
Did anyone else have any questions, or I can go over some other ones that I was sent?
Oh, any tips on prepping for the LSAT? So I used, at first I got Kaplan, but I really didn't like it. Then I got a private tutor and I found that a lot more helpful. Usually the best way that I would recommend writing the LSAT is write it under time conditions, as if you're writing the actual exam. Take one day to write the LSAT and then one day to review all the questions that A, you got wrong, or B, that you got right, but you guessed. Is the best thing. But I would strongly recommend that when you practice, do it under time conditions, and kind of learn what questions you want to skip, what questions you want to do, so on. Part of writing the LSAT is learning what questions to skip. You don't have to write all the questions, so kind of just getting a good idea of that. But I would recommend under time conditions 100%.
Are they like logic-based questions on the LSAT?
So the LSAT has three main components. So one is called logical reasoning. So this is just pure logic questions. So it's like assumptions, strengths, weaknesses, kind of assessing arguments, multiple choice. So like, say for example, I was like, Dhruv likes red shirts, therefore Dhruv will wear a red shirt, right? Well, what's the assumption? The assumption is that Dhruv wears shirts that he likes, right? Like, and it's kind of like identifying that middle link between an argument. The second part is called logic games. These are just like little puzzles that are really, they're really easy to learn. But they're just little puzzles that you have to kind of figure out based on like a set of rules. So they give you a finite set of rules, then you have to organize the puzzles. And then the last one is the one I think people hate the most, which is ironic because it's the one most relevant to law school, but it's called reading comprehension. And so you essentially just get like a 2-page passage and you have to read it, and then they'll ask you various questions from the passage. And you kind of have to figure out, kind of answer the questions. Okay, let's see. When did you start studying for the LSAT? Was it while you were doing your undergrad or during a gap year? So I did the LSAT during a gap year. I studied for about 3 weeks, but for those 3 weeks, I studied really, really hard. And I essentially did what I recommended, which was I would write a practice exam under time conditions. I would grade the practice exam that day, and then the next day I would go through and review all the questions that I got wrong or all the questions I wasn't sure about. And then I slowly got better and better. And once you start getting more familiar with the different practice exams, the questions will start to seem more familiar. I also had a private tutor who really helped me. So if I really struggled with something, he would go through and kind of explain everything to me and kind of understand like why why is it this and not this, and so on. And you kind of learn when you study for the LSAT to identify the right sentences and the right things in a passage so that you can do it as quickly as possible. Anything else?
I had another question someone asked. They wanted to know what hard and soft skills should someone working in corporate law have?
That's a very good question. So soft skills are very, very important for corporate lawyers, especially because in many cases, we are the ones facing the client. For most lawyers, soft skills are very important. There's some lawyers who can get away without them. For example, like tax lawyers, because they tend to work more behind the scenes. But things like good interpersonal skills are very, very important. Being able to connect with someone, being able to have a conversation with someone who might be from a completely different background, who you have nothing in common with, and just being able to make a service level connection with them. Also, finding the right middle ground between being able to please your clients but also manage expectations, because one big issue lawyers fall into, and especially corporate lawyers, is they're so rushed to please their clients that they make unreasonable expectations. And until you become a lawyer, you don't really understand how complicated the law is, and everything seems so simple from the outside. Like, everything seems so simple until you actually get into the nitty-gritty of it and you realize how complicated it is. So a lot of what you have to do is manage expectations and make sure people understand that it's not it's not as clear-cut as you might think. But definitely interpersonal skills, communications, being able to make a connection, and just honestly being someone who people want to work with is really, really important. And then Libby asks, is there a time limit for the LSAT? Yes, so there's 3 sections and 4 sections, I think, and you get 35 minutes each or 45 minutes each section. And then you get a break in the middle of the 2 sections. But yeah, each section is timed, and you have like a set number of questions, like 50 questions or something, and you get like 45 minutes. So it's like a very, very heavily timed question or exam.
Don't stress too much about the LSATs for now, because later today there is a speaker who will talk all about them, and he can answer most questions you have. Does anyone else have any more questions for corporate law and Aamir?
So one thing I think a lot of people are probably thinking about right now is like, what type of law should I get into? Like, I don't know if I'm going to be a corporate lawyer or like anything like that. You guys have like a lot of time to figure it out, and like you're not expected to know what you want going into law school. Most people don't even know what they want leaving law school. That's one of the benefits of like working at like where I work is like it's called a full service firm because we get to try every type of law. So I got to try tax law, corporate law, litigation law, employment law, things like that, bankruptcy law, and then I got to kind of figure out what I liked and what I didn't like. And there's a lot of things that will come to mind. Different groups have different cultures. Different groups have different types of work. Obviously, different groups have different work-life balances, and you kind of learn to kind of read the attitude and the atmosphere of the group, and you kind of find a place that you fit as well. So it's good that it's good to start thinking about these things, but definitely don't feel like you have to figure out what type of law you want to do right now or anything like that. Like you have tons of time. Even in first year of law, everyone takes the same classes, so you can kind of start to figure out what you like better. And then once you start taking electives in law school, that's when you really start to be like, oh, this is really interesting, or like, oh, this is really boring, and kind of put together where you think your career is going to go. How competitive is it to get into law school? I mean, I think it's relatively competitive. Like it's not impossible. There's a lot of law schools. Like I know U of T, I think our median or something was like a 3.86. So you usually want to be aiming for like a 3.7 GPA or above is kind of what you want to be aiming for to get in. There's obviously a lot of law schools and there's some of them that are slightly easier to get into than others. So it's not like, extremely difficult. I think the real competitiveness and struggle of being a lawyer comes after you graduate. So I think that kind of is what is more important, as opposed to just getting in is not. I wouldn't say getting into law school is the main hurdle. I would say once you start practicing, that's when people start to burn out the most. All right. So I have a few more questions. Where you do your law degree matter when looking for jobs? In Canada, not so much. People are the law schools here are all pretty good, and most of the firms are pretty, ambivalent to all the law schools. Like some firms will hire deeper into different law schools, but it's also those law schools tend to objectively be more competitive to get into. It depends. Like I know in the States where you go to law school really matters. And if you want to go from Canada to the States, like if you want to work in New York or something, then there's only like a few law schools like U of T or McGill, which are like an option for that. When picking law schools, the key thing everyone always says is go to law school where you want to practice, because that's where you build your network, and where law is a networking profession. So I think that's something that's like really important, like where you want to practice. Obviously also price is a very important factor too, especially if you're not interested in something like corporate law, where you don't tend to make as much money starting out. Then it is important to go somewhere that's a little bit more affordable. How's the gender diversity in corporate law firms? That's a really good question. So in my class, we were a class of 15, and we had nine women and 6 men. So we had a lot more women than men in our class. Generally, I find when the firms hire, they try to hire at 50-50. One thing that you will notice is the gender diversity tends to get a little bit worse as you start working up the corporate ladder, whereas a lot more of the senior people tend to be men. But I know the firms are taking a lot of initiative to try to promote gender diversity as much as they can. I know there's a lot of women in corporate law groups. To whether this is something that is working or not is not something I can personally answer. But from on the outside looking in, it seems like something that they're trying to address. And I know at least in my cohort, we had a lot of women lawyers, and I know out of all, I think they hired 6 people into corporate law at my firm, and it was just me and one other guy, and I think the rest were women. And would you recommend traveling to the UK to finish law school quicker? Personally, I wouldn't. I've heard a lot of horror stories about the UK. First of all, I know you have to write a bunch of exams to come back. And generally it's really, really hard to find a job. The people who I know went to the UK, most of them came back and worked as assistants for 2 years before being hired as articling students. I think the UK is a great option if you want to live there and you want to practice there, but I think to come back here, it actually is a lot harder than just going to a Canadian school, even though it might seem more attractive on the surface. And so, yeah, so just kind of back to the whole corporate law issue. A lot of firms have like a very broad definition of corporate law. Like there's other kind of types of law that kind of fall under the umbrella. So you have things like real estate, which is something that frequently comes up. Bankruptcy is something that frequently comes up, which is kind of the same level of transactional law that corporate law has. So that's also something like when you kind of think about corporate law, it's important to think about like what exactly are you thinking about and what exactly attracts you to corporate law? Like, is it just working with corporations or do you just like the type of work? Because there's a lot more that you can do that's just not with corporations. That's very similar work. All right, 2 questions here. Do law schools care about which law school you did your undergrad, or is the emphasis more on your LSAT and grades? 100% LSAT and grades. They really don't care about where you did your undergrad, unless maybe if you went to like an extremely elite school, like maybe to like a little bit they'll like it, but for the most part, it's all your grades in your LSAT. It's like most schools like UBC, they don't even look at your application. They just essentially take your grades in LSAT, and if you're below a certain threshold, they just toss your application, then they read the applications. Is corporate law really math heavy? No, not at all. The accountants and the bankers do the math, we just do the legal aspect of it. And we take what they say from a math perspective at face value.
I think someone wanted to ask or wanted to know more about what you studied before going into law school.
Sure, yeah. So I went into undergrad in business actually, and then switched over to criminology because I enjoyed it a little bit more at that point, and I kind of just wanted to get the best grades that I could. At that point, I actually really wanted to be a criminal lawyer because it seemed really cool. And then I finished undergrad and kind of became more interested in the business aspects of things. So I did the joint degree at U of T. I did my law degree and my MBA. And the reason that I did both degrees was if I didn't go to law school, I would have done an MBA. So I figured, why not do both, and why not, get them both done in a streamlined fashion? So I did both of those, and then I went into corporate law. The MBA is really not necessary for corporate law. I think it's helpful. It gave me some useful skills and information, but it's not something you have to think that you need to have or it's a must-have or anything. But yeah, that was my educational background.
Thanks. Did anyone else have any last questions? Because the workshops will be ending in around 10 minutes.
What did your week typically look like while you were in the JD MBA program? So essentially the way the JD MBA is structured is the first year you do full law school, the second year you do full business school, and then for 2 years you do a mix of business and law school. Depending on whether you were in business school or law school, your days look very different. So law school is 100% exams, right? There's like no quizzes, there's no participation, there's no midterms or anything. You have lectures, you can go if you want, you have textbooks, you can go if you want. And at the end of the day, at the end of the semester, you go into a room, you open your laptop, professor gives you a question, you sit there, you type on your laptop for 3 hours. After 3 hours, your laptop automatically emails the test to your professor, and that's it, that's your grade. So in law school, things are a little bit more long-term. The studying is a lot more long-term. Generally, I would get up, do some readings, go to class, come home, maybe do a little bit more reading. So I felt like it. If I didn't feel like it, I would procrastinate on my readings and then kind of rinse and repeat. Business school is a lot more, there's a lot of participation, a lot of quizzes, and a lot of group work. So while law school was really about me setting my own schedule, business school was usually dictated by someone else's schedule. Like I had usually group meetings, quizzes to study for, networking events. Like I was out of the house a lot more and usually running around. So they were kind of very vastly different in that respect.
I had one more question from someone. They wanted to know a little bit more about what two things. What major issues and trends you see in the field today, and they also wanted to know more about like a typical workday, like what you would do from start to finish.
Okay, sure. So typical trends issue. I'm sure you guys have read a lot of issues with lawyers, and I think a lot of that is not unwarranted. We are a profession that's a little bit slower to adapt, I find, especially among the old guard. And I think there's a lot of changes that are going to happen to the way law is done and the way it's practiced. I think right now we still operate on a very old school perspective of going into the office and having this big fancy office and kind of all that stuff, whereas things will probably shift more towards us providing immediate legal services as opposed to us being like a 9 to 5 kind of office shop. And I think COVID has really changed that. So law is becoming more remote in general. Like, we are given the options to work more remotely, which is good and it's bad. It's good because we have more flexibility. It's bad because we're expected to be available more often. So pre-COVID, I could go home at 8 p.m. and probably wouldn't have been disturbed that much. Whereas post-COVID now, I'll still probably get emails at 8 p.m. because, I have my laptop and so on. So that's kind of what is changing, is how we can deliver effective legal services as efficiently as possible with the changing realm of technology and kind of the changing demands of clients, which I think is going to be fine, but it's just something that we need to adapt to. And I think we are a slower profession to adapt. And then the other question was, sorry, what does my typical day-to-day look like? So for corporate law, it really depends, but like, I'll give you an example. Usually, I'll get up at 6:30 in the morning, generally check my phone, probably got like 2 or 3 emails overnight, either on a deal that I'm on or from a lawyer, quickly respond to my emails, get ready, go into the office at 8, kind of want to beat the rush, sit down, get ready, doing something called docketing my time because we bill per hour. So I'll go and I'll sit and I'll type out everything that I did the day before so we can bill the client for it. Then usually I'll have some long-term project that I'm working on. Either it's like some deal that's really far down, and kind of what I'll do in my downtime, and I'll start drafting. Generally for corporate lawyers, between like 10 and 3, I'll just be like getting phone calls and emails and running around. It'll be anything. It'll be like, hey, we need to change this in this document. Hey, we need to change this in this draft. Hey, you need to run down here and pick up these documents. Hey, this client's on the phone and they have this legal question. They need to know the answer within a couple hours. Can you look it up? So you'll kind of, between like 10 and 3, I'll just be running around. Essentially, we call it putting out fires. And then usually like from 3 to 7:30, 8, I'll kind of go back to my more long-term work and get that done. And then obviously it depends. If I have a deal closing, then things are a lot crazier. Some days I could have no work and I'll go in at 10:30 and I'll sit around till 2 and I'll go home. So it's really dependent. And that is something about corporate law that is different than a lot of other areas of law. It is very erratic.
There's a lot of unpredictable things that happen.
A lot of unpredictable. It's very difficult for me to know what my week is going to look like.
Mm-hmm. So it's like very important to know before going into corporate law, right?
Yeah, like you have to be okay with kind of being all over the place, because at the end of the day, you're working for executives and CEOs who have a lot of pressure on them, and they want things done very quickly, and they might not necessarily understand how complicated or how long the stuff that we do takes, and they're going to want it done right away. So that's something to really keep in mind with corporate law versus like something like litigation that tends to be a lot more stable.